Big Pharma. The name alone conjures images of collusion, big money, and major influence. In this series, we're going to take a look at Big Pharma and its powerful influence over media, doctors, and even you. And we're going to give you an unprecedented look at the truth behind the tactics, the strategy, and the revolving door between the FDA and these big pharmaceutical companies that claim to be looking out for your health. The first step toward truth is to be informed. And stay tuned after our episode for an important message on health. Well, it is a stunning accusation. The former commissioner of the FDA accused, along with her husband, of making hundreds of millions of dollars while suppressing information about deadly drugs. The RICO lawsuit was filed April 11, 2016 in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. on behalf of 8 plaintiffs who claim they suffered severe harm by ingesting the drug Levaquin, whose deadly risks were concealed to protect financial interests. The 2 of them are accused of collusion, conspiracy, and racketeering alongside the pharmaceutical giant Johnson & Johnson to conceal the deadly risks of Levaquin. From the lawsuit, while defendant Hamburg was FDA commissioner, her husband, defendant Brown's annual income, not coincidentally, increased from a reported $10 million in 2008 to an estimated $125 million in 2011. And an estimated $90 million in 2012, due in whole or in part to the defendant's racketeering conspiracy to withhold information about the devastating, life-threatening, and deadly effects of Levaquin. The lawsuit brings to light just one portion of the problem between troubling relationships in the FDA and Big Pharma. Though clearly what is alleged here, if true, would be one of the most dramatic examples in history. A public citizen petitioned the FDA in 1996 and again in 2006 to issue black box warnings for tendon rupture and tendinitis. Had warnings been issued, the death toll from Levaquin, reputedly more than 5,000 by the way, and the tens of thousands who were debilitated with life-threatening diseases, would likely have been averted. And yet Levaquin was a blockbuster drug and it was heavily prescribed by doctors. The FDA and many of these organizations that are supposed to oversee these pharmaceutical companies and these drug makers, were they failing in their role to be able to determine whether or not these drugs were dangerous? Doug Bremner is an author, a doctor, and a professor at Atlanta's Emory University. When the FDA is looking at a drug, they're essentially determining whether or not that drug is safe based on the information they're being given. But if the drug itself is dangerous after the fact, they're not following up to determine whether or not that's true?
Congress has limited the budget of the FDA over the years, so they've capped the budget so that it can't increase, but they've also demanded that they increase the speed with which they approve drugs. So the number of people working on new drug approval has been increasing at the expense of those who are supposed to be watching drugs after they come out on the market.
The FDA is approving drugs, but once they're on the market, there's very little oversight, as in the case with Levaquin. But getting drugs past the FDA, that can also be a case of collusion on a number of levels.
The thing about the FDA is not a full-time, a career job. It's a few years on the FDA, and then they're being courted by the pharmaceutical companies.
Lori Powell is a former brand strategist for a medical education agency which serves the pharmaceutical industry. She says there is a difficult balance here because while the FDA officials are supposed to be watchdogs over pharmaceutical companies, they're also constantly courted by pharmaceutical companies.
You'll have a Merck going in and saying to somebody on the FDA, I'll give you $600,000 if you'll come and work on our regulatory committee to go into bat for us with the FDA. And they'll say, okay, well, I'll think about that. And then there'll be like a Pfizer will come in and say, well, we'll give you $800,000 a year to come in and work on our regulatory committee. And so it becomes like a bidding war like that. So the FDA knows that their next jumping off point to go from a lower paying government job to be a very lucrative pharma job on the inside, on the manufacturing side, they know that that's part of their career path. So that, I'm sure, weighs heavily into their decision-making process.
So the question is, should that practice be banned? If you want to work for the FDA, shouldn't that be what you have chosen to do?
Those people that work there should not be allowed to go to work with pharmaceuticals. They should not have any contact with those people. They should realize that their job is serious and it's important, and if they want to work there, that's their career.
And yet fraud between the public and the private sectors happens every day. What you need to know here is that fixing the revolving door between a government agency like the FDA and these massive pharmaceutical companies actually is pretty easy. Shouldn't it simply be illegal to work for an agency like the FDA and then leave that public sector job for a job in the private sector that you once oversaw regulation for? There are some who will say, hey, you can't do that. We're a capitalist economy. But allowing regulators to be in positions of power that can be bought off or influenced by their massive companies that they're supposed to oversee, well, folks, that's not capitalism. It's cronyism. And the only people who likely believe that it's acceptable are those who stand to profit from it.
Nature and health works together in our exclusive natural supplement, Bee Panacea. Bee Panacea is the only supplement that brings you 20 Eastern herbs and superfoods infused into raw honey. Bee Panacea increases energy, immunity, and focus. It is also anti-stress and anti-aging. Bee Panacea, the healthiest teaspoon you can have today.